Today, we're going to be speaking with Tim Jackson, who's an ecological economist, professor, and also author of the book Post Growth: Life After Capitalism. It's so great to have you on. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here, David.
So, let's start with something that, to a social democrat like me, is still something that is in the back of my mind, which is that we are on a planet that has some maximum capacity in terms of resources, in terms of population carrying capacity, etc. Our economies are based on a little bit of inflation is good, and where that inflation comes from is the expectation that there will be more productivity in the future than there is today. And GDP has to continue going up, or we consider that we're in a recession. Structurally, at some point, that becomes a problem, right? Is that a sound place to start the conversation?
Yeah, I think it is a sound place to start the conversation, David, and it's definitely where I start as well. And it's surprisingly easy to kind of make that argument, to ordinary people in the streets. In a way, we're living on a finite planet. The economy is supposed to expand forever, we're told by economists. Surely, at some point, expanding economy into finite planet doesn't go. So what on earth is going on? And what's surprising, I think, is that that's a difficult proposition for politicians of any color, I would say, to really take seriously or to know what to do anything about. Um, and economists typically, I would have to say, tend to think that the economy is about money. It's not necessarily about stuff. And so, if we're clever enough with our technology, we can sort of get ourselves off the hook and work our way round all of these resource limits. And I
Yeah.
suppose, that's an argument.
Right. And so one of the arguments that's frequently made is, while what you're saying is true, at this point, it's basically theoretical in the sense that it's very far out. And, 100 years ago, nobody could have predicted exactly the way things are today. If we're talking thousands or tens of thousands of years from now, things will be so structurally different that this is at minimum going to at in the best case it will resolve itself. In the worst case, we'll have the tools with which to deal with it by the time it's really a problem. But that doesn't really seem satisfying as an ecological answer.
Well, I think where it falls down to is that might be true for some kinds of resources that we might run out of, but actually we're already running out of what you could call ecological space.
Mm.
We're running out of climate stability. We're running out of the other species on the planet that are being decimated because of human activity. We're running out of clean water and clean air and clean oceans, and that running out is actually something that's happening right now. I mean, the evidence on that is alarming. Just simply the climate change evidence, what's faced, the west coast in terms of heat, and the east coast in terms of flooding, and Europe in terms of flooding, and Australia in terms of heat. Almost everywhere you look on the planet, we're seeing these extreme weather conditions, which suggest that somehow that far out scenario, that expanding economy meets the limits of the planet, actually isn't that far out after all. It's kind of right here on our doorstep.
One of the issues, I guess, that economists are confronted with within this kind of conversation, within this paradigm, is there are certain aspects of how we think about an economy that are kind of taken for granted. I mentioned already, if GDP isn't growing, this is a country that is stagnating or in a recession, in a decline. That's one aspect of this. Debt and deficit and how that relates to how a country is doing is a big piece of this. How would those metrics have to be completely rethought under the umbrella and framework that you propose?
Well, I think in a way, GDP was never a very good metric. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is go back to the words of Robert Kennedy speaking in 1968, so 53 years ago, where actually he was a prominent politician prepared to acknowledge the limits of this measure of the GDP and say, look, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, he said, but it misses out the damage we're causing to the planet. It doesn't include the positive things that people do for free in their own homes. It's just not a very good measure of our well-being. And so in a sense, the answer to your question, well, let's start with some better measures of what really matters. And some of those measures, like our sense of well-being and our sense of purpose and so on, could be measures which are very unfamiliar to politicians, and that's a little bit of a challenge. But others of them are really quite simple, like not measuring, for example, how much we are degrading our capital assets in the economy itself is something that the GDP is notorious for failing to do, and not putting any sort of sense of cost on the damage that we're causing to the environment, and not putting any sort of value on the work that people do in their own homes. All of these things, actually, and there are very, very good attempts to improve that measure of the GDP, but you could almost say at this point in time, almost any distance towards measuring something more meaningful than the GDP would be a step forwards, because it's just not a very good measure of progress. It's not a very good measure of human progress in society.
So in terms of some of those things, the universal basic income movement, which has different names, proposes itself as a way to put value to that which is done in the home, for example, or that which an economy may not currently value. Carbon taxes would be a way in which we might put a monetary value on the degradation or of the environment or the pollution that's released, et cetera. Is that thinking too small still, or are those good ideas, good steps?
No, they are very good ideas. In some ways, something like the universal basic income is, and I think when, one of the architects of the universal basic income, Andre Gortz, talking about it first, or talking about it seriously in the 1960s, he wasn't the first person to talk about it, but what he sort of said was it's a sort of stealth concept. Because by changing our relationship to the way that we earn money, and by changing our relationship to the way that we work, it enables us to think in massively creative ways about all the valuable things that are happening in society, like, kind of volunteering in our community, and the free work that happens in the home, and looking after our elderly and looking after our kids. And it allows us to put a value on those things which, in the purely capitalist system, in the system of the market, if you like, just don't have that value on them. So I'm in favor of those, but I still think, to answer your question, I would say they are tools in a toolbox. And the difficulty sometimes in implementing those tools, using those tools, is that the architects of the system don't allow them to be used. So the example of ecological taxation, for example, we talked about for decades, and yet it's really hard to implement because of the politics of a growth-based economy.
Well, that's where I was going to go next, which is when we talk about, convincing people, getting people on board, et cetera, it seems that 2, 4, and 6 year political terms in a variety of different countries are completely mismatched with the timeline and priorities that are required to deal with these issues, where a lot of these things are longer term projects. And if your next election is in 2 years or 4 or 6, it just seems to be fundamentally at odds with the timescales that we're talking about to actually make some of these structural changes.
It is at odds in many ways. And I think, that's not the only thing that's wrong with the political system, because the other thing that's wrong is it becomes, in some sense, because of the way in which political parties become funded, they end up being a sort of apologists for the status quo, of defending invested interests. And that sometimes stands in the way of them representing the interests of the poorest in society, the most vulnerable in society, including, of course, the other species we share the planet with. So we do have to think much more seriously, I think, about the role of governance and the role of power within government, and think about that, as you're suggesting, with a much longer term view. And again, there are some interesting initiatives there That in Hungary, there's something called the Ombudsman for Future Generations, a kind of representative of people who are coming way down the line from the future and are not represented by the democracy of the day. And that's been taken up in Wales, in the UK, but with a Future Generations Act. And there's this initiative, in fact, to change the way that government works, to bring the future into our decision making in the present, is a really important part of thinking about how we address those long-term issues.
Certainly, part of this would also be more citizens demanding these things of elected officials. And there are a lot of sort of bullet points that are often repeated by those who don't want to take these issues more seriously about how such structural change would impact our day-to-day lives. Things about, you might only be able to have small cars in the United States, or gas might be $20 a gallon, or you might not be able to use your air conditioning whenever you want, or really a lot of this day-to-day stuff. At the personal level, what would a paradigm shift the likes of which you propose really mean for individuals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my work over more than 3 decades now has been really work in policy, and it's been about suggesting the kinds of economic policies that would address some of these issues. And in fact, just over 10 years, 12 years ago, the previous book that I wrote was called Prosperity Without Growth. It was written for policymakers. It had all of these wonderful ideas, like ecological tax reform, universal basic income, different ways of valuing the environment, different ways of measuring well-being. It had all that stuff in it, almost like a kind of shopping list for what politicians could do on Monday if they really cared about this issue.
Right.
And it's been fascinating to see that not happen. And it doesn't happen for all sorts of reasons: vested interests, short political timescales that we talked about, but also that fear within politics that the electorate will not stand for this kind of change. It's a hard, tough place to be, in which our lives will become less comfortable, more arduous, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of language of fear that populates this debate. And in a way, what I was trying to do in Postgrowth was to say that's a mistake. The fear that we should have actually is of an economy that doesn't respect the environment, that doesn't respect the value of human labor in our lives, that doesn't value these things properly at all, and that is driving us towards, a divided world in which our environmental resources are being degraded at a rate we can't cope with anymore. That's where dystopia lies. And so Postgrowth is really about looking for where an escape route from dystopia might exist. And I think that that's led me across philosophy, it's led me across psychology, it's led me across politics, and indeed, moral thinking about the ethics of our world. And the thing that leaps out at me, I think, most clearly from that is that the potential for human development, for human progress outside of this very materialistic, consumer-based, growth-driven economy that we've inherited is huge. It's massive. Because at the end of the day, the kind of world in which I think we thrive is one in which our relationships are strong, in which our community feels secure, a world in which our work is not just good in terms of income and keeping us going, but is meaningful. It has purpose for us, and that sense actually of living in a world in which there is hope for the future because we're taking those environmental limits seriously is a tremendously creative place. And I've been fascinated in particular by ideas from within psychology, which sort of suggest that actually somehow materialism and the comfort of consumerism stand in the way of us making real human progress. They stand in the way of us developing skills because we become too lazy. They stand in the way of us developing active lives because we become too comfortable and sit around eating too much and being comfortable. And being comfortable is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking being comfortable, but there's a sense in which being outside of that comfort zone takes us to our true potential as human beings, where we learn those skills, where we engage in activities that give us satisfaction, where we feel as though we're embodied in a world in which we have meaning and purpose, and in which there is hope for the future. And to me, therefore, where I came out of that exploration is really that this post-growth world is a richer place to be, not necessarily in terms of money, definitely not necessarily in terms of material possessions, but in terms of our capabilities to live truly fulfilling lives as human beings, and to return to ourselves that sense of hope in the future.
Yep. And of course, the challenge is in the midst of consumer culture that bombards people, it's getting people to even be open to the idea that that may actually be richer and more fulfilling. Certainly an uphill battle. The book is,
I think, in a way,
yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Just on that point, David. I mean, I think that's true, and yet there are a million places to start with that.
Right.
How we educate our kids, how we think about our own progression through life,
Yeah.
what decisions we make about where we invest our money and our time. All of those are places to start. So although, there are a lot, as you say, there are lots of obstacles to that, to making those kinds of choices. There are also there's a myriad of opportunities for making them as well.
Well said. Well said. The book is Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism. We've been speaking with Tim Jackson. I so appreciate your time today.
It's been a pleasure, David.